Hi, my name is April, and welcome to High Fantasy Writing. The video that I had planned on filming was actually about how I got into D&D, but the MCU series Loki that came out on Disney Plus just wrapped up, and I saw a couple of takes online, mostly on Twitter, that I really wanted to address from a writing standpoint. Now, I have noticed this trend in critiquing media, especially things like comic book media, where I'm not sure if it's just they don't understand how stories are written or if they've gotten used to a different type of storytelling. But when the storytelling begins to deviate from what they believe it should be, it's a very common thing for people to leap onto this different storytelling than they had anticipated and say it's wrong, it's bad, it's incomplete, or it's focused on the wrong things, it's too slow, it's too fast, the pacing is off. And I find that when I'm seeing these opinions and critiques on the story, they don't really explain why they feel the pacing is off, or why they feel like it was incomplete, or why they feel like it was wrong. They just say, it's wrong. And I prefer to delve into why you feel that way. And in this video, I want to take a look at some very common writing 101 techniques that would I don't want to say disprove people's opinions and critiques on the Loki finale, but it is definitely a different way of looking at it that from a writer's point of view, I see it very clearly because I'm very familiar with these writing techniques and story building techniques. So to get straight to it, the criticisms that I have seen about the Loki finale, a lot of people are saying that it didn't stand on its own, that it actually was just a glorified trailer for Phase 4 of the MCU, and that it didn't bring anything of its own to the table. It didn't wrap up any storylines, it didn't actually do anything but set up for other properties. I personally feel like that is the most wrong way of, like, I don't understand how one could watch the series of Loki and think that, because as I'm going to go through in this video, it has a very clear plot structure, and the plot that it sets up at the beginning, the goals and concept for the story, it's a full character and story arc. It is full, it is complete, and I am going to share with you why I feel like that might have missed some viewers. So a very common way to set up a plot, especially when it is a character-driven plot, like is in the case with the Loki series, is you introduce your protagonist, who does not have to be a hero. It is just the character who is the main character, who you follow, whose story you are seeing from their point of view. It's not first-person point of view, but the story very closely follows this one character. And what you do is you take that character and you decide when you're plotting out the story, brainstorming, you look at this character and you say, okay, what does this character want? And that is the most basic part of storytelling, is your main character needs to want something that they are then going to go after in the plot of the story. Now, what I find the most interesting way to play with this want aspect of a character building experience is to have then a separate need for the character. That the character at first might not even understand. They might not know what they need. They might think that what they want is what they need. But through the course of the story, character progression happens, new things about the world and themselves are revealed through the story, and then they realize that what they need wasn't actually what they had wanted at the very beginning of the story. I find this to be the most compelling way to write a character-based story, is to have the character really, really want something in the beginning and then only later realize that that is not what they needed. Usually, once they have actually gotten what they wanted, they then realize that through the course of the story they have changed or they have realized new things, and that what they had wanted originally is not what they needed. This writing technique is very, very clear in the Loki series, both through the character of Loki and the character of Mobius, who is kind of the co-lead of the Loki series. Now, I feel that Sylvie, who is a character who comes in slightly later in the series, I think that she is going to have this same arc, but we haven't completed her arc yet. But we have completed Loki and Mobius's. Both Loki and Mobius start out with very clear goals in the beginning of the series that they later, through the course of the series, they gather new information, new things are revealed, and their goals have become muddled. Why they wanted those goals have become muddled with this new information, which expands the world and expands themselves as characters. I'm going to start with the titular character of Loki. Now, we have known Loki throughout the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He's been in many, many movies, and where we pick up with him in the series Loki is actually before he has had the majority of his character development through the MCU. We pick up with him just as he has lost the Battle of New York and has been captured by the Avengers. Now, through Endgame spoilers, through the shenanigans that happen with time travel in the Avengers, he's actually able to get his hands on the Tesseract at that point and zoop himself into a little portal and come up in a completely different part of the world, escaping justice for his crimes in New York. This is when the Time Variance Authority comes in. They capture Loki, they bring him to their location where all of his magic is taken away from him, and he is set to face punishment for actually not the crime of attacking New York, but the crime of being a variant. So he has stepped off his predetermined guide for what he should be doing in this sacred timeline. And this is where we get a whole bunch of information about the sacred timeline, that there is only one, and anybody who deviates from it and might perhaps create a new timeline, they are pruned by the TVA agents, and so their timeline, this new timeline that they would have created, ends. Because the goal of the TVA is to keep it just a singular timeline that has been preordained by who they believe are the timekeepers. So that is all necessary information to understand Loki's goal and his want throughout the series, and also Mobius's, because Mobius is an agent of the TVA. So he has a vested interest in keeping the sacred timeline intact. Now, Loki, we find out in the first episode, his want is to exercise free will. He wants to be the writer of his own destiny, and he does this prior to arriving at the TVA by subjugating others, enforcing his will upon others, and that makes him feel as though he is worthy, as though he is writing his own destiny and is not at the mercy of others, by placing others beneath him. Now, once he gets to the TVA and it's revealed to him that actually his entire life has been planned out for him. Every step he takes is actually what the timekeepers have decided he is allowed to do. He becomes very angry at this, as I'm sure many of us would, and his goal, in order to get to his want of free will, self-determination, his goal becomes to work with the TVA, ingratiate himself in them so that he can find these timekeepers and bring them down. It's kind of hinted that he wants to put himself in the place of the timekeepers and he wants to rule it, but his main goal is just to free himself, get to these timekeepers and take them out. So when you're setting up a story, especially character-based, you want to think of 3 things. First, what is it this character wants? For Loki, he wants free will. He wants to determine his own destiny. And the second thing is, how are they going to get to that goal, that want? What actions are they planning to take? What is their action plan for the story that you have set out to write? For Loki, that's ingratiate himself into the TVA and find the timekeepers so that he can take them down. Now, the third thing is to take a look at how you can change this character's perception throughout the story so that they find out that perhaps what they wanted at the beginning isn't what they really need. And as we find out throughout the story, Loki's need, it's similar to his want, but it is achieved in a very different way than he initially thought. His want is to be free to determine his own destiny. And he feels like he has to do that alone at the beginning. He feels like he is always going to be alone. Nobody could possibly care about him because he is just the trickster. He cannot be trusted, and so nobody could possibly want to be with him. He will always be alone. By the end of the series, he realizes that he is not happy with that course for his life, that he wants to have connections with people, and that he is extremely insecure about the fact that the timekeepers have determined that he will be alone. And the moment he tries to make a connection with someone, he is killed off or pruned from the timeline. As the Loki variants that we meet later in the series put very plainly, the moment they try to better themselves, the TVA comes in and calls them. And Loki is not happy with this. He wants to change. He doesn't want to be the person he was in the Battle of New York anymore. He wants connection. He needs connections. Moving on to Mobius, his character arc is similar in structure. He has a very clear want at the beginning. He has an action plan of how to achieve what he wants, and then he realizes through the course of the series that what he wants isn't actually what he needs, because he discovers new information that completely changes his way of viewing the world. So first, Mobius wants to protect the sacred timeline and ensure every citizen is protected from the chaos that would be a multiverse, because the TVA has taught him that a multiverse leads to multiversal war, and he wants to protect people. And so, protecting the sacred timeline and protecting people, his action plan is to hunt down variants and prune them. And when we are introduced to him in the series, his specific goal is to capture the Loki variant known as Sylvie. That is his action plan. Protect the sacred timeline by capturing Sylvie. Now, by the time the series ends, at about episode 4, I believe, of the series, Mobius has his eyes opened and his entire perception of the TVA has changed. He no longer believes that the TVA is helping people or protecting them. He now believes that the TVA is oppressing people and are murdering millions upon millions of innocent people just because they exerted free will. And so Mobius's want from the beginning is actually quite similar in its basic principles as it was in the beginning to the end. He still wants to protect people. The way he does that, though, is drastically changed. He no longer believes that the TVA is helping people and protecting them. He now knows that he needs to restructure the TVA or burn it to the ground in order to make sure everyone has free will and nobody is stolen from their lives, as he now realizes the TVA has been doing. Now we get to the part of the video where we discuss whether the TV show has completed these two character arcs and their wants and needs and goals. I feel that it is very clear that this series is a very complete story. Both Mobius's goal in the beginning, his want at the beginning, and Loki's goal and want at the beginning are achieved through this limited 6-episode series. It is a very tight story. It has a lot of esoteric moments. It has a lot of dialogue and sitting in this strange multiversal time variance authority type of world. So it's not a whole bunch of action, which a lot of people think is the only way you can write stories that are tight and engaging, is there has to be a whole bunch of action. But I personally feel like this series does a really, really great job of deconstructing the characters, deconstructing the world, and how we view and they view the world itself. And I find that extremely compelling. So, was Loki Season 1 just a glorified trailer for the next season of Loki, or the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe in Phase 4? Let's go over what a complete story would do. It would have characters introduced, their wants and goals introduced, and then their wants and goals would be achieved by the end, or at least partially achieved, so that we can bounce to Season 2. That's just the nature of serialized television, is that Season 2 needs to link with Season 1. There needs to be some overlap there. Some series, like Criminal Minds and CSI, can be very episodic in nature, but they do still have overarching season-long and even series-long stories that continue from season to season. I feel like this season of Loki was very clear in its Loki wants to ingratiate himself in the TVA, find the timekeepers or whoever is behind the TVA, and bring them down. What does he do at the very end? He ingratiates himself in the TVA, gets information that leads him to the timekeepers, realizes the timekeepers are fake, and so he then goes in search of whoever's behind the timekeepers. At the end of the series, he finds this person and takes him down. That's a complete arc. That is a complete story for Loki Season 1. Now let's take a look at Mobius's. Mobius wants to capture Sylvie in order to protect the sacred timeline. What does he do? He enlists our Loki variant's help. They go out, they find Sylvie, Mobius captures her. Boom. It happens in episode 4, so we have a couple more episodes for him to realize that that's not actually what he needed. He gets new information from Sylvie, Loki, and the discovery that Hunter C-15, I believe it was, he gets new information that shows him that what he needed wasn't actually the reality of the world. That what he believed the world to be and what the TVA to be, he realizes that that was not the case. That his need and want has now changed based on this new information. And he wants to take down the TVA, just as Loki and Sylvie do now. And so what does he do after episode 4? When he is, that was really painful when I saw him pruned. Oh goodness, I was really concerned there that he was gone for good, but thankfully he was not. And so what does he do in episode 5 and 6? He helps Loki and Sylvie out, and he goes back to the TVA to begin to unbrainwash, unindoctrinate the different hunters and people of the TVA. he goes to break down the TVA and show them that they were once variants and that they should have free will. Yet again, complete story arc. So did the goals that were set out very clearly for the two main characters of the series Loki, did those goals get fulfilled? Yes, they did. Did the needs get fulfilled? Not yet, but they are on their way to fulfilling them. And I believe that a complete story does not need to follow the character throughout their entire life to make sure that their need that they realize that is more important to them than their want has been fulfilled. I don't need to see Loki's hundreds of thousands of years long life and see him connecting with people for years and years and years in order for me to feel like it was a complete story. Just the fact that he has recognized that this is now a need that he has, that he wants to pursue, and him beginning to pursue that is enough to complete the story. Now, did the Loki Season 1 set up Loki Season 2? Did it set up Doctor Strange, the Multiverse of Madness? Did it set up Ant-Man Quantumania? Did it set up the further expansion of the MCU for Phase 4? Yeah, it did. That's good series writing. That is good writing for something that is part of something like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Every single thing in the MCU is connected to each other. That doesn't mean that every single TV show or movie, its sole purpose was to set up this next thing. It can have its own story solidly in that series or that movie that then also opens up the world to more things down the road. Did you watch Iron Man and say, that was a great story, but you know that end credit scene with Sam Jackson coming in, I had enjoyed Iron Man until I realized it was just a trailer for the Avengers? No, you didn't. Did you watch Civil War and say, oh, that was a really great story until I realized it was just a setup for Black Panther? I'm guessing you didn't think that. Did you watch The Winter Soldier and say, that would have been a great movie if they hadn't made it so that we could set up Bucky's future story? No. Stories, especially stories like in the MCU and comics in general, everything is connected. So they can tell their own individual story while also opening up for huge, huge ramifications in the world at large. It wasn't even like the villain in Loki was a fake villain that they didn't actually defeat or resolve his whole issue within the season. He wasn't a hologram that was there to misdirect him and so he could get away. He wasn't a face for the real villain that they actually haven't found yet. He was the person that they found at the end of Season 1 was the person they were looking for. He was the creator of the TVA. Killing him, taking him down, which was pretty much everybody's goal by the end of the series. Destroying him, getting him out of absolute control of the timeline, has now opened up new things for the future. Resolving the goal of Season 1 has opened the world up to new stories. That's not just being a trailer for other movies and other aspects of the MCU. That's having a contained story that has ramifications in the larger world that the MCU has been setting up for over 10 years now. Now, if that's not the type of storytelling you like, then that's fine. But to say that because something that happened in a limited series has ramifications for the larger world, because of that, that means that the series was pointless and didn't add anything and didn't have its own story, you're just wrong. You're just really, really wrong from the most basic writing standpoint that there is. This series was very well written. So Loki's character arc, the introduction of the TVA and destruction of the TVA, finding and discovering who he who remains is and destroying him, these were all completed character arcs and story arcs within the first season of Loki. Multiple stories got started and had some sort of resolution to them. Does that mean that there is no possible furthering of the story? No, but that's not a bad thing, especially since they have intended this to be at least 2 seasons. As we saw at the very, very end, Loki will return in season 2. When you watched Iron Man 1, did you really think that there was nowhere else for Tony Stark to go? That he had fully resolved every single issue that he could possibly ever have in his entire life and in this entire world, where his introduction of the Iron Man suit has encouraged others to create the Iron Man suit, as we have seen in season 2, Iron Man 2, which in turn causes its whole host of issues. But you wouldn't say that Iron Man 1 didn't actually have a story of its own just because Iron Man season... Sorry, it's not a season, it's a movie. Just because Iron Man 2 built off of the things that were started in Iron Man 1. That's just how serialized things go. Loki Season 1 is the exact same. It set up actionable goals and it achieved those actionable goals. It was an entire story arc. In Loki Season 1, what was set up to be resolved in the very beginning of the season was resolved by the end of the season. Now, like all good storytelling, throughout the story, new things about the world were discovered. The world was expanded beyond the main character's limited perspectives of it. That's what makes storytelling interesting. You don't just have a basic premise and then you achieve that premise with no change from the characters and no change from the world. What makes it compelling is that the characters realize that what they wanted at the beginning actually wasn't what was either really going on or wasn't what they actually needed, and so they needed to change their goals. Usually this only happens once they have achieved their goals and then realized it didn't sit the way they thought it would. So I hope through this little video you have seen where I'm coming from a writing perspective of why the criticisms of Loki Season 1, that it wasn't its own story, that it didn't wrap up as a completed season, and that it was just there to set up Marvel Phase 4 rather than tell its own story. I hope you now see why, from a writing perspective, those criticisms are just not the greatest criticisms, and they're not really based in any writing fact. If you want to learn more about why stories are written the way they are, take a writing class, watch some AuthorTube, read books, read comics, because trust me, I've been getting into comics and boy, are there some, they are not the tightest writing. There is a whole bunch on the outside of the main story that is not resolved within the main story. Comics are, in my limited experience, comics are a very narrow focus story, but they have a whole bunch of stuff on the outside that might be in their own comic issues that you need to go off and read along with it. with the other storyline that you're reading, if that little ancillary thing interests you, but it's not going to be resolved within the tight little story that the comic you're reading is dealing with. I have read books, watched movies, and seen television that was clearly just a setup for the next season. But this was not that. Loki Season 1 told an entire story and also expanded the universe for future projects in the MCU. Now, this video is not addressing anything except for that very specific criticism that I saw on Twitter. There is a lot to be said about Loki not being written particularly well as a gender fluid character, as was hinted at and teased by the creators, especially in that first episode where you see his little chart that says sex fluid. That I feel like wasn't particularly written well, nor was his being bi written particularly well. There were problematic aspects that you can go into talking about those aspects of the storytelling, but in the very specific critique that I am talking about in this video, so please don't comment something that has absolutely nothing to do with what I talked about in this video. The critique that Loki Season 1 was not its own story, but rather just a setup for Phase 4 of the MCU. I feel from a writing perspective, that critique is completely wrong. It holds no water, and people making that critique, I feel like, have a fundamental misunderstanding or lack of knowledge about writing. If you would like to watch some of my other videos about critiquing and how to tell if a critique is good or not, I actually have a very specific video about that. It's mainly geared towards people who are writers and are in the beta reading critique partner phase, so they're trying to determine if the critiques they're getting back on their work are valid and something they need to take a look at or not. I do have videos on that. I also have some videos about being a critique partner and also about some other TV series from a writing perspective that if you would like to check out, I would be very grateful. If you got anything out of this video, leave a like, subscribe if you would like to see more. I am planning on expanding what I talk about on this channel. Like I said at the beginning, I am interested in talking about Dungeons and Dragons as well from a writing perspective and how, as a writer, I approach being a DM and being a player as well. And so I hope that that is of interest to you, but if not, no worries. I have a whole bunch of other content that I am doing as well. My name is April, this is High Fantasy Writing, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and happy writing!